That's great. We'll make a start and then we'll let other people filter in as they do. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our inaugural SCL Sustainability and ESG Committee event. We're delighted to have so many of you signed up and so many of you joining, which is brilliant. And we're also delighted to have a brilliant panel of speakers for you today. In keeping with the ethos of our committee, what we've done today is we've held this event online. Of course, that minimises the carbon footprint for travel for this event, but we're also mindful that it means that a lot of people can attend the event. We hope it's a convenient time for lots of people to tune in and listen to our interesting panel. This is going to be the first of a couple of events that we're going to run on behalf of the ESG SCL committee. So please do provide feedback on today's event, and also please send us some ideas of the topics that you'd like to hear us discuss on these panel discussions. This event, as you'll be aware, is focused on ESG in a lawyer's day-to-day lives. So what we want to do as part of this event is raise awareness of various initiatives that are out there, what law firms are doing internally, and also what in-house legal teams can expect from their external counsel. As part of that, of course, we've got our brilliant panel discussion, which is going to kick off. But just before that, we've got a couple of short video clips from a number of those initiatives to explain to us the work they're doing and the kind of initiatives that are out there. So Simon, over to you for some of those videos, and then we'll pass over to Sarah Ellington, who's going to be our wonderful chair for today. Thank you.
Hello, I'm John Sturrock, and I'm a mediator based here in Scotland. It's now almost universally accepted that changes in the climate pose an existential threat to millions, probably billions of our fellow human beings in the years ahead. The enormity of the situation is hard to fathom. The scale of the response which is required is huge. At times like this, individual efforts can seem futile. And yet, it may only be the accumulation of millions of individual efforts which will make a difference. We must at least try to make the effort where we can. That's why over 600 mediators from every corner of the planet have pledged to do what we can to do something to reduce our carbon footprint. Our Mediators Green Pledge has already been translated into 15 languages and has been supported by many of the world's leading conflict resolution organizations. We have committed to cutting out hard copy papers and using only electronic documents if we can, to considering how we travel, to fly only when necessary, and to using online platforms wherever that's possible. We encourage others to consider the environmental impact of any physical location we use, including heating, air conditioning, and consumables. We will do the same with our own places of work. We're committed to raising awareness of the pledge, and we're grateful for this opportunity to do just that. You can find out more on the website www.womac, that's WOMACC.org, the World Mediators Alliance on Climate Change, www.womac2cs.org. Thank you for watching and listening.
Hello, my name is Nicola Gare, and I'm the Global Disputes Knowledge Lawyer at HFW, and for the purposes of this presentation, possibly more importantly, a member of the Greener Litigation Pledges Steering Committee. I'm delighted to have been asked by Damien Croker to highlight the pledge and how you can get involved. I'm sure many of you will have heard of us, but it might be helpful if in the next couple of minutes I just highlight the who, what, and whys. So who are we? The Greener Litigation Pledge was founded by a group of litigation lawyers in 2019 following the huge success of the campaign for greener arbitrations founded by Lucy Greenwood a few years previously. There is overlap between the groups, and for example, many of us are involved in both. I'm on the steering committee for both, for example. Both organisations have the aim of reducing litigation and arbitration's respective carbon footprints. There are, however, significant differences, which I'll come on to shortly. The Greener Litigation Pledge has a mission statement setting out practical changes we as litigators pledge to commit to in the journey towards net zero. We were founded by the following 11 organisations: Mishcon de Rea, my firm HFW, Simmons & Simmons, Addleshaw Goddard, Covington, Freshfields, Kennedy's, Three Crowns, Field Court Chambers, Herbert Smith, Freehills and Opus 2, and now have 67 signatories. So what are our objectives? Broadly, these are for the courts and court users of England and Wales to play an important role in achieving the 2050 net zero emissions target, to encourage lasting change in litigation practice, both within the UK and around the world. Our immediate goal is to change the way in which dispute resolution practitioners conduct litigation so as to reduce the carbon footprint of court disputes in line with the objective of restricting global warming to 1.5 degrees C as set out in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Longer term, we aim to act as a catalyst for change to policy and procedure to embed meaningful and permanent change into the rules of litigation practice, reducing climate and other environmental impacts. So what are you signing up to by taking the pledge? Well, I've set out a high level here. In taking the pledge, you undertake to take steps to reduce the environmental footprint and GHG emissions of your disputes practice, to support changes to rules, procedures and practices, and to reduce the environmental impact of proceedings, actively promoting reduction of the environmental footprint in the ways that are set out on this slide, and also to spread the word, so to let others know that you support the Greener Litigation Pledge and encourage their participation. Is signing up to the pledge the end? Far from it. All signatories of the Greener Litigation Pledge are invited to participate in the Greener Litigation Project. The project aims to engage with practice, procedure and policy to reduce the environmental impact of litigation and to further the objectives of the Greener Litigation Pledge. We have dedicated working groups to help actively drive forward change in litigation. These include the Technology Group and the CPR and Court Engagement Group, by way of example. So thank you for listening. Hopefully you're now keen to sign the pledge and join the 67 other signatories in reducing the litigation footprint. Please access the pledge page on our website, or if you'd like to discuss, please drop me an email. Again, many thanks for your time.
Hi, I'm Sarah from the Chancery Lane Project. I'm here to talk to you very briefly about the project, what our goals are and how we go about achieving them. The Chancery Lane Project is a non-profit organisation and a collaborative initiative of over 2,500 lawyers and industry experts from over 300 organisations. Our vision is a world where every contract contains a tool to tackle the climate crisis. We know this seems like a very ambitious task, but when you really start to think about the role of contracts in the economy, you'll start to understand why it's so important. Contracts govern how our economies operate, and therefore have huge potential as leverage points for changing business as usual practices so that they are in line with the net zero pathway and our global goal to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees C by the end of the century. Right now, everyone in this room or watching this video, along with your networks, colleagues, partners up and down the supply and value chains, will be bound by contractual obligations in some shape or form. And it's very likely that performance of those contractual obligations will produce greenhouse gas or GHG emissions. Our aim at the Chancery Lane Project is to reframe those contracts and those contractual obligations and to repurpose existing contractual mechanisms, for example, pricing mechanisms, incentive schemes and reporting requirements, so that they reduce GHG emissions and also deliver on ambitious sustainability and emissions reductions targets. So, how do we go about doing this? With our fantastic network of contributors and collaborators, the Chancery Lane Project drafts and publishes climate-conscious clauses which are net zero aligned and are climate conscious, but are also practical and commercial. The clauses are drafted for direct implementation into law firm precedents and existing contracts, and we also publish and maintain a helpful swathe of tools to help contracts be drafted in accordance with net zero guidelines. Although each clause has a full title, we like to name our clauses after children in recognition of the fact that we're drafting for their future. We currently have 114 clauses and an extensive glossary of climate terms on our website. The clauses vary in ambition and can be tailored to suit a party's resources, capacities, and where they are on their own journey to net zero. A good starting point are our entry-level clauses, which are universal and include climate-aligned NDA and confidentiality provisions, very short recitals, and heads of terms. The clauses on our website are categorized by sector and industry and practice area, including finance, agriculture, energy, logistics, insurance, the built environment, which we have a specific project for, and many more. I really implore you to check out our web clauses on the website and also use our climate clause selector tool to sort by practice area. It's all very well and good us publishing these clauses, but what really gets us out of bed in the morning is lawyers and their clients using the clauses in contracts, and indeed drafting all future contracts in accordance with our net zero guidelines. To help this, as I've mentioned, we also publish a collection of helpful drafting tools, such as a net zero drafting checklist, net zero guidelines and explainers, which can all be used to educate and upskill yourself and your staff. We also host regular workshop series, so please keep an eye out on the website to see what's on. And you can always reach out to us directly for a one-to-one clinic or a more informal chat. As I say, all of our content is free to use with no commitment wall or registration required. All we ask in return is that you use our clauses. Thank you.
Hello, I'm David Snyder. I'm a law professor at American University in Washington, D.C.
I'm Sarah Dadouche. I'm a law professor at Rutgers Law School in New Jersey.
And I'm Olivia Wyndham-Stewart, and I'm a senior fellow at Rutgers Law School in New Jersey.
We want to talk to you today about managing ESG values in supply chains by harnessing the power of the supply contracts themselves. The idea here is to use contracts as a practical, powerful tool to improve human rights and other ESG values throughout the supply chain. These clauses are the work of the American Bar Association Business Law section and a number of lawyers within it, but I should emphasize they are not the official policy of the ABA or the Business Law section. These model contract clauses are available for companies to use to manage this risk. First question, why should we use them? Clear answer. You want to achieve effectiveness of the policies that you have at the corporate level. Contracts are your key tool for implementing them throughout the supply chain.
Now, the MCC's 2.0 shift away from traditional contracting regimes in that they're based on human rights due diligence, as enshrined in the United Nations Guiding Principles and the OECD Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct. Sarah is going to walk you through what that means in many practical ways, but it's essentially to say this is really a shift towards shared responsibility contracting, so the buyers and suppliers are both responsible for the human rights outcomes in their supply chains.
So how do we achieve this? Three key distinctions between the MCCs and traditional contracts. One is that we would recommend that buyers and suppliers take on a joint contractual obligation to each carry out human rights due diligence throughout their supply chains and to steer away from traditional regimes that would ask the supplier to make a unilateral representation or warranty that they are in compliance with the buyer's human rights policy or supplier code of conduct. A second key distinction is that buyers would have contractual responsibility to support their suppliers' human rights performance by engaging in responsible purchasing practices. And a third key distinction is that we would set aside traditional contract remedies, or rather prioritize over traditional contract remedies that would flow from the breaching to the non-breaching parties, victim-centered human rights remediation that would place addressing the grievances of the victims ahead of traditional contract remedies.
Thanks very much. I hope you're interested in our project. We're happy to talk to you about it further. Our contact information appears on this slide. Feel free to get in touch.
Hi there, my name is Adam Woodhall and I am the CEO and founder of Lawyers for Net Zero. And in this brief video, I'm going to tell you what we are, why we are here, and how do we do this. So what we are is we are focused on supporting general counsel and their teams to take climate and ESG leadership. Now, why do we do that? Because what we've seen is that in-house counsel have a unique position to be able to support the driving of net zero, climate and other environmental pledges and goals and plans in their organizations, because they can use their position to both champion the right thing to do and also help deliver the rapid practical action, because they're very aware of the risks and the reputational challenges and the rules and the regulations that are impinging on all businesses now, wherever you are in the world. And so that through that, you can help influence your suppliers, you can influence your colleagues, and through that, that means you are driving climate leadership. So how do we do this? Well, we have our impact program, which is focused on individual in-house counsel joining a program using our unique group coaching plus. And what this is focused on, as the title suggests, group coaching sessions, but there's a lot more to it than that, which we don't have time to go into now. But it's a fantastic process, and we're getting great results from in-house counsel who are helping, working with us to build their agency to drive this net zero goals, their environmental goals in their organization. So I would be delighted if you would join us on our website, lawyersfornetzero.com, or find us on LinkedIn. And you can connect with me, Adam Woodhall, on LinkedIn too. Looking forward to communicating with you.
Well, hopefully that's given you interesting insight and overview into some of the things that as lawyers we can get involved with on the ESG and sustainability agenda and think about incorporating into our own practices. We're now going to move into the panel part of the session where we want to really discuss practical examples, what's worked so far, what might work in the future. During the session, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. Please do that. You don't need to wait until the end to submit questions, and hopefully we'll have some time to answer those after we finish the main discussion. So first of all, I'd like to ask the panel to introduce themselves. Ian, do you want to kick off?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Sarah. So I work at DLA Piper. I'm the Director of Responsible Business. My role is really to make sure the firm stays on its own pathway in terms of SESG, sustainability and ESG performance. And that covers ensuring that the governance is in place, that our reporting is in place, our stakeholder engagement is in place, and that the firm is really focused on its key material sustainability issues. And operationally, unsurprisingly, it means decarbonising the firm as quickly as we can, making sure that our supply chain is as responsible, sustainable as it can be, and working with our suppliers on that basis, and working closely with the communities in which we work and impact and our clients on the social impact agenda as well. So essentially, it's about embedding sustainability into our operations and increasingly working with our lawyers as they take the ESG offering into the marketplace.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, hi. So I am an in-house lawyer at Vodafone Group, so covering both our group function and working with all of our 20 or so national operating businesses. I'm a competition lawyer, so I don't have a background in ESG, but I'm here because in 2018, our CEO launched the concept of Vodafone as a purpose-led organization. 3 pillars to that being digital society, inclusion for all, and planet. And then off the back of that, within the legal function, Rosemary, our GC, was very keen that we set up some teams to ensure that the legal function was engaged in those 3 pillars of our purpose, and also to ensure that we were proactive in finding ways for us to really contribute in achieving the group's goals. And I co-lead the team that focuses on planets. I'm also involved in our inclusion team. And I come at this from an additional angle, which is that I sit on the team that manages our relationships with our external panel law firms. And in that role, a key part of my responsibility is to liaise with them on looking for opportunities to work together to take forward our respective goals and to achieve our respective goals on ESG issues.
Thanks, Nick. Raluca?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Sarah. My name is Raluca. I have been working at the crossroads between business, finance, and sustainability since before sustainability became the hype or the trend that it is today. I began about 15 years ago as a lawyer. Then I moved into the public space. I worked as an independent counsel for the European Commission at the time when all of the regulations that we see nowadays in the environmental field, but also more broadly across all of the ESG fields, were just in the making. And then I moved to the private practice and worked as the general counsel, where I'm also working now. So in Amsterdam for Fairphone, one of the thought leaders in sustainable electronics, and how can we create better consumer products, and recently started at the Impact Facility, which is a platform organization that is bringing together funders and mining communities to create better supply chains for the electronic sector. With all of the knowledge and seeing all of these repetitive issues around ESG matters, 2 years ago, I co-founded an initiative, a foundation, which is called Legal Innovation for Sustainable Investments, where we aim to make investment documentation more approachable, accessible, and appealing for all the investment stakeholders.
Thank you, Raluca. And last but certainly not least, Damien.
Hi, so I'm an arbitration mediator with a focus on the tech sector. I'm also founder of ODR Plat, which is the only carbon neutral online dispute platform currently on the market. I signed the arbitration and mediation pledge. I urge anyone listening to this to do the same. ODR Plat is a supporter of the litigation, mediation, arbitration pledges. I'm a member of the campaign for greener arbitration. I'm actually chair of the Latin America Committee, actively involved in promoting the arbitration pledge in Latin America, and with a very great team that I work with. I'm also a member of the Mediators Beyond Borders International Climate Change Project, which is involved in resolving disputes that occur as a result of climate change. So climate change is creating a lot of disputes around the world, and Mediators Beyond Borders is very involved in trying to mitigate some of those issues. So yeah, and I'm also a member of the Society for Green Arbitration ESG Committee. Thank you.
As well as our SCL ESG committee, Damien, which we're very pleased to have you on. Thanks, Damien. I'm Sarah Ellington. I'm a partner in the dispute resolution team at Watson, Farley and Williams. So I know that dispute resolution is one of the more carbon intensive parts of the profession, and obviously a number of the pledges and initiatives are aimed specifically at disputes lawyers. In my disputes practice, I focus on ESG disputes as well as technology and outsourcing disputes, and in particular on the S part of the ESG. And it's very interesting to see our discussions as a SCL committee, but also in terms of the initiatives that we see, There's definitely a lot of activity around the E, the environmental, the climate change, that hasn't necessarily got so much into the S part of things yet, but certainly I think through the work that you and I are doing at LISI, Raluca, and through things like the model clauses initiative in relation to the human rights agenda as well, I think we're seeing some more of those S issues coming through. So thinking about the panel, we've got a really great spread of different people that undertake different roles at different types of companies. Nick, I wanted to start with you because I think you're probably reflective of a relatively large proportion of the SCL membership and the audience, working at an established technology company, working in competition law, so you didn't start out as a ESG lawyer, and I don't think you'd necessarily think of yourself as an ESG lawyer now. But for you, what's the kind of transition been like from working in that traditional role through to taking account of more of these ESG issues?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been at Vodafone since September 2017, and Vodafone as an organisation launched this purpose-led concept in 2018. So I've kind of been there for most of that period, or for all of that period, and on the one hand, it feels like we've built quite a lot of momentum, and we've done a wide variety of things. But I think we'll look back in a few years' time and realise that at the minute, actually, we're at a pretty early stage, really, of embedding this into the legal function, especially because, as I imagine is the case for a lot of in-house lawyers, we don't have people dedicated to this. It's people who are interested and want to make time to try and pursue these goals, these initiatives. I mean, I'll just sort of give a couple of examples to give a flavour, and then I guess that's a starting point for discussion, because I know you don't want me to go on for too long. So if I put the first one on under the more sort of planet banner, the E in the ESG, I guess, one of the things that we've done is, we heard from the Chancery Lane project just before. So we've engaged with them for the last 2 years or so. So we internally ran what was sort of billed as a hackathon, essentially workshopping with a group of in-house lawyers and other people, some of the model clauses, to think about which ones might be more or less interesting for us, more or less feasible for us to try and build into some of our contracting practices. And then we have actually managed to make use of the clauses in a more real life way. So we have we've looked at some of the clauses in the TCLP playbook and use them as sort of, we haven't just copied and pasted them, we've used them as inspiration. Initially, we used them for a particular transaction where it sort of came to our mind that we ought to be thinking about this, and it probably wasn't something that we'd really thought about before. And then that led us to think, okay, actually in our procurement function, this should be more embedded. So we've created some template clauses in our standard form procurement agreements that are sort of tailored to vendors or suppliers who have different risk profiles, if you like, from an environmental perspective. So we've made use of the Chancery Lane project, certainly. And then I'll just mention briefly on the inclusion side, something else that we've done to sort of try and drive change both internally, but also looking to start a change across the industry a little bit more. When we last refreshed our panel of external law firms, we agreed a document with the firms that were selected called, I think it's called Taking D&I Forward Together. So it's a set of principles, and it covers a few things. So know-how sharing best practices on things that, where the firms have done stuff that they think has worked well or not so well, or might be of interest to us, that, they agree to share ideas with us. And then we have some, to the extent that regulation allows it, some targets in terms of representation of females and people with other diversity characteristics on the teams that work with us. So we have some targets that we agree with some of the firms. And we take a kind of carrot rather than a stick approach. It's a kind of, if those targets can't be met, let's work together and talk about it and figure out how can we get closer to those targets, rather than we'll kick you off the panel if you don't meet the targets. Yeah, and then also thinking about mindful ways of working. So when you start new matters with a firm, talking about, do people have flexible working arrangements that they need to stick to, and establishing those from the outset, because things like that do actually go to inclusion. Because if you don't bear in mind things like that, you can inadvertently exclude people or make life more difficult for people than it needs to be. So those are a couple of examples of the things that we've looked to do to kind of get started, I guess, on this journey in a more serious way. And I'll stop there because I'm mindful of time, but happy to discuss other things or come back to those as we go on.
Thanks, Nick. And I think that that really reflects the comments that we saw from Net Zero lawyers in terms of in-house lawyers really being able to drive change within the value chain, but not just for net zero, but in terms of the wider social and governance aspects as well. Ian, obviously you're on the kind of receiving end of this, being based in a law firm, notwithstanding that you're not a lawyer, but I know that your team is, you know, at the forefront of being able to really respond positively to these types of requests.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen is over the past 2 or 3 years, quite a marked shift in terms of our client expectations across a firm's ESG performance. Even just 2 years ago, really, if you were able to show that you'd signed up to certain pledges and commitments and you had certain systems in place, and there was a fairly tick box approach when it came to securing a spot on a panel or winning a pitch. But nowadays, I think our clients are much more interested in how you can explicitly collaborate on joint sustainability issues. So in terms, for example, if we just stay focused on net zero and decarbonizing our work together, our clients are increasingly asking us, so this is a new matter, a new instruction, what is the carbon likely to be associated with this? And what can we do together to reduce it? Are there suppliers that we can jointly work with that are more sustainable, and even producing ultimately carbon budgets associated with work together? Or on the D&I side, as Nick was saying, it's not a question of just having plans and systems. You absolutely have to field a diverse team, an inclusive team, and more than that, actually potentially work with clients on their own D&I strategy and align together to make sure that health and well-being is part of that account. So it's really clear now that there's a very distinct shift away from systems and processes and signing up to certain commitments, right through to show us the impact, show us the change, come up with ways how we can work together. Now, bearing in mind, of course, that's doable for a large account that we may bill a lot against, and there are a lot of lawyers involved, and that can bring in the responsible business or the D&I team to support them. But even for smaller accounts, there are plenty of opportunities to collaborate, even in the thought leadership way. So there's been a real shift from the loose and the baggy to the really defined and focused, I would say, in terms of client expectations on sustainability and ESG.
Thanks, Ian. And then Raluca, just thinking about another kind of contrasting experience, and I know that you've worked in a number of different areas, but perhaps just concentrating on Fairphone as an example. Obviously, you worked in that company which had sustainability at its core before it was trendy, and also very much from the kind of startup phase. So just be interesting to hear a bit more about your experiences, especially dealing with external lawyers, and, you know, comparing and contrasting with Nick's experience.
I think that it's very interesting what we're discussing here, and also very important. And from the perspective of a smaller company, and then also Fairphone was a company that was really set up to be a thought leader in sustainable electronics, and also with a more experimental mindset. I think for me, as being the first in-house counsel, and then having the opportunity to build the legal team and the legal processes, and also to create the relationships with our lawyers, one of the most difficult things that I've experienced is to really find lawyers that were able to think along, not only in terms of how do we address the risk, but how do we look at the opportunities? Because I think that when we look at supply chain of electronics, what we see is that all of the issues around the world, you name them, you have them in the supply chains. And it's really up to us as lawyers to try to have a better approach as to, you know, how do we come up with all of these innovative models or all of these innovative structures where we can still protect our businesses, but also be more forward thinking. And I can give you a concrete example here. At Fairphone, we like to talk about something which we call the 100%ism. 100% fair, 100% sustainable, 100% ethical, you name it, we can make a paper trail for it. If we look in the supply chain, and if we want to create a paper trail to show how, how things go well, we will actually be able to do that. But sustainability started being transparent and started being and accepting why is there a need towards shifting the whole world and the public policy and private practice together with it towards sustainability. And that is because the world is not perfect. And we have to, in order to create the change that we need to see in the contracts, in the practice, in the mindset, and also within ourselves, and where do we find meaning within our profession? How can we still be really good lawyers and be partners, real partners to the business? Also kind of meet the world where it is and not start at the latest draft, what worked in the last deal, and whatever we think it's the best thing in order to possibly address all of the risks. But really think about what are the realities of what we're dealing with, what is our actual approach that we can take, and not be just advisors, but really take our responsibilities as members of these teams, and working together as a team, sharing that responsibility towards bringing some change in the legal instruments and in the way we see and we talk about these issues.
Thanks, Raluca. And I know, Ian, I can see you nodding there. And certainly when we were discussing in our preparations for today, you really had an idea of lawyers becoming more than just lawyers in the future.
Yeah, I think, and again, of course, I'm not a lawyer, but in my conversation with my legal colleagues, it's very clear when we think about sustainability and ESG, as just been mentioned, it's no longer about a discrete piece of advice against a certain challenge. Certainly our younger lawyers are very keen on understanding the bigger picture and where that client is on their sustainability progress. I'm not going to say the word journey because I loathe it in relation to sustainability, but where they are on their sustainability progress, because any piece of advice or any piece of work cannot be considered in a discrete way. It's going to have knock-on effect to where that client is in relation to decarbonizing the social and environmental transition that they're on, where they sit within their sector, what sort of external partnerships they're able to strike. And our lawyers, I think, no longer can be expected to, nor should focus on a particular discrete aspect of the work that they're doing, because that isn't how the world works. It's not how business runs. Yeah, I think equipping our lawyers to understand the bigger sustainability picture and how that relates to the piece of work that they're doing is going to be increasingly important. And that's actually a real challenge for law firms to reskill their lawyers on that basis.
Thanks. And Damien, I guess we've heard about a number of initiatives, and they're obviously a really good place to start if you want to learn more about things. And I know that you're involved in quite a number of them. Is there one particular one that we should be sending lawyers to? How do the initiatives work together? What's your view on, how we should be, grabbing hold of these initiatives and really utilizing them in our practice?
There are a number of initiatives at the moment, and I think if I was sat in a law firm, I'd be wondering where to start, actually. They're a starting point. You've got if you do contracts, transfer lane project, very helpful. If you handle disputes, you've got the various green dispute pledges. What's needed is probably more guidance on implementation. It was very interesting what Adam had to say from Lawyers for Net Zero and their impact program, which kind of helps people to understand what they need to do. I think that's very useful in a corporate world, and probably within law firms. I think that kind of program would also be quite helpful. But the pledges are very much at a early stage, and we're sat here in the UK and we're kind of advanced, and curiously, the pledges are from the UK. The initiatives are all UK based, and I did say to someone in Latin America recently, I just pointed that out, and their reply was kind of amusing in that they said, well, you did start it all in the first place, didn't you? So we got the blame, so we should find a way forward to resolve it. Anyway, that shut me up. The pledges at the moment are at various stages. You've got the arbitration one, which is very involved and all over the world now. Literally thousands of arbitrators have signed up, institutions, law firms. It's very well established. You have at the other end, you've got Greenland litigation just kind of getting off the ground, and somewhere in between the mediation with its 600 signatories, which is great, of course, and all around the world. There are still significant areas which have not any attention yet. And I talk about the courts. Courts are, in fact, the biggest emitter of greenhouse emissions in the legal system. And there are no initiatives now to reduce that. And there really needs to be a greater use of mediation. Mediation is still not in enough contracts. No point putting in green clauses and then not including the greenest form of dispute resolution in your dispute resolution clause. So, and go online, great place to be, quite green, and we've got used to it with the pandemic, thankfully, in a bad way. So yeah, so I think, go online, mediate. Needs to be more pressure on that too. Okay, I've answered your question.
Yeah, great. So a lot of progress, but still quite a lot further to go.
There is.
And especially, the need to think about how this rolls out across different jurisdictions. Yeah.
Implementation is the word that I get back from people. Well, this is all great. How do we do this? You have the pledges, lots of protocols. I need some help in making this happen in my organisation. And I think something like the impact program from Lawyers for Net Zero is a great idea.
Thanks. And then just turning again to the in-house perspective, Nick, is it helpful for you when you see that the law firms that you're working with have signed up to some of these pledges, that they've been working on clauses for the Chancery Lane project?
Yeah, I think that's definitely of interest, and I think it might well become increasingly so. I mean, being very honest, I think, we're probably not as educated or aware as we would like to be. We're still learning about all these different schemes. I think a lot of them are quite young. So there's an element of us, getting to know them, educating ourselves on them, also seeing how they pan out, which ones turn out to be the most useful. In reality, there's also, you've got to think about, if every law firm is signed up to every scheme, then it becomes a bit meaningless. So we'll have to see how that goes. But yeah, I think there definitely is potentially some value. Clearly the fact that we've engaged with the Chancery Lane project. I mean, a lot of law firms in the city are engaged with the Chancery Lane project, but that is helpful for us. So, for example, I mentioned that we did that hackathon a couple of years ago, and if the firms on our panel are engaged, that means they can support us on that. So we had, a couple of firms that worked with us when we did that internal that hackathon. And for example, there's another organization called the GC for D&I, and we certainly encourage our panel firms to engage with that process. And we did an event actually with some of our panel firms a few months ago focused on social mobility in the legal profession. And off the back of that, we then sort of spoke to them and said, actually, look, GC for D&I has been thinking about social mobility. It'd be really helpful if some of you could get involved in that particular work stream. So yes, I think these at least some of these groups will be increasingly of interest, and we see value in them. Yeah, because I think also we don't think about just achieving delivering for ourselves. I think the mindset is more there's an opportunity here to work across the industry, across the legal industry with our panel firms, and to create a sort of ripple effect across the industry. And that's where you really are going to make a difference, right? Rather than just something that's done within Vodafone.
Yeah. And Raluca, we've heard quite a lot about these being predominantly UK-based initiatives. And obviously you're based in the Netherlands. Now, I know that UK and perhaps the US as well definitely gets a bad rap in terms of dispute resolution for things like, you know, very intensive disclosure regimes, a lot of time in court, etc. I don't know from your perspective whether it's different, whether you're expecting people to be involved in initiatives, or whether it's more about the individual lawyer and how they're dealing with things.
Yeah, so some of the things that Nick said, I also definitely recognize, and I see them here as well. What I see here as practice more is lawyers forming groups and coalitions and think tanks around legislation, and how, because obviously we're also closer to the European Commission and everything that's going on, and we have all of this legislation coming our way. Some of that is really quite forward thinking and very, very ambitious. So I see a lot of developments there. And also, you know, I think if I have to go back to understanding versus forward thinking versus how do we apply that in practice. And some of the things that we've been also doing at the Legal Innovation for Sustainable Investments is to really think about how do we make law and legal instruments more approachable, appealing, and accessible. And that really requires coming together and thinking about, you know, things that we never think about, like what are the KPIs and metrics? How do we define success of a deal? How do we define success of a contract? Because, you know, sometimes we look at how do we save money? How do we work more efficiently? How do we keep those timelines going? And of course, those are really, really important metrics. But we should also be thinking about the stakeholders and the people that are at the negotiation table, but also the people that aren't at the negotiation table. And when we talk about sustainability and impact, we mostly refer to stakeholders, to things that happen deep down in the supply chains, whereas we write our contracts, you know, in Europe, in the UK, and then where we define that impact is not here. So I think that my wish would be that more of these great initiatives would get more scale. There's a lot of phenomenal ideas out there, but also if we have to look at our profession, we don't see a lot of standardization. We all seem to stick to our own drafts and things that everybody has the better draft. And especially I have to look here at my colleague lawyers, because I do think you all recognize that in terms of working with different drafts and giving advice to your clients regarding drafts. And how the question would be, and the common reflection would be, if we need to actually make a real contribution towards a fair transition to a sustainable economy, to bring in more sustainability in our businesses, in our supply chains, how can we all come together and agree on certain things that we can all start using and all start developing through co-creation rather than competition, and working towards that common goal? I personally find it a very challenging and very interesting thing to be looking towards in the legal profession of the future.
So I think that as a profession, we need to have less time with our head down looking at the detail in the paperwork, and more time with our head up looking around us and really listening to what's going on and to each other. I mean, Ian, as someone that's in charge of responsible business at a very large law firm, and thinking about having a very established cadre of lawyers, but also the new lawyers coming through, how do you embed that with the new lawyers? How do you change people's working practices that they've developed over decades?
Okay, that isn't a small question. Thanks for that, Sarah. I mean, what we're getting to really is kind of the nut of the agenda, really, which is the role of lawyers and law in building a more sustainable and responsible world, right? And that's a massive agenda item. That's always been part, of course, of what lawyers and law firms do, but it's now very explicit. And the clock is ticking, certainly on the environmental front. And sure, we can change the skill sets of all our lawyers, and we're doing that. And we can run training programs, and we're doing that. And we're, for example, at DLA Piper running a carbon literacy program that will be rolled out to not just the lawyers, but everybody who works in the firm. Because what our young lawyers especially are keen on is understanding that when they choose the firm to work for, they want to know that the firm is committed to the sustainability agenda, and that there's purpose associated with why they're in the firm in the first place, because they can go to a lot of other places, and they expect the firm to put its money where its mouth is. They expect the firm to decarbonize, and ultimately to find a way to measure the impact of the advice that they provide. Because ultimately, scarily for the sector, the elephant in the room is going to be, can you quantify the impact of your advice as a lawyer and as a law firm, and what difference is that advice making in terms of a client's own sustainability trajectory? Can you unpack that? Can you quantify that? And what are you doing around that? And that's a hard nut to crack. And we're all thinking behind the scenes around what that looks like. And it's much broader and deeper than making sure that we give all our lawyers the opportunity to engage in pro bono projects. It's not that. It's aligning the firm's core business model to a sustainable world. So if you think, and again, it's in many ways the easy bit of the elephant to take a chunk off, and it is the environmental and the net zero agenda. We have targets, we have plans, we have science-based targets, even net zero plans. But what we're all working towards now is a transition plan. So for professional services in a law firm, that means, is your core business strategy aligned to a 1.5 degree world? And that raises questions around the type of work that you do and how you quantify that. And that's ultimately where we need to get to, because other sectors have had to do exactly the same. And there's nothing special about law, as somebody who's not a lawyer and felt relatively new to the sector, that means it's immune from that. I think very quickly, the legal sector is going to come under scrutiny in terms of finding ways to quantify the difference of its work in relation to its clients. It's real scope 3, scope X, whatever you want to call it. I think that's what's coming around the corner. And I think already the young lawyers who are coming into the firm, they're asking us exactly those sorts of questions. And all law firms need to be able to answer that.
Yeah. Damien, also sitting in a privileged position as a non-lawyer, if you could kind of wave a magic wand over the profession, and I say here, with the exception of making us all mediate disputes, because we know that you feel very passionately about that. What do you think we should do? More initiatives? Something else?
Not more initiatives. We've got so many initiatives now. I'm confused about some of the names now. They're all sounding very similar, and they all sound the same. There needs to be some joining up. I think it's a great, Lucy Greenwood needs to be flagged up here as really starting this off in terms of pledges. The green litigation followed, and mediation followed, and then litigation. They essentially read the same. Then you have the implementation side of it, things like Chancery Lane project. You've got the net zero Alliance for law firms, and then you've got the lawyers for net zero for corporates. All these things are trying to achieve the same, and we really need to have some kind of joined up story of how we can make the world a greener place. And the legal profession is key to this, especially in-house guys like Nick and Raluca. You can change the world. You can make your supply chain green, and you can make the law firms that work for you be green. Although I appreciate it's a two-way process with law firms, as Ian has expressed previously. Let's have a joined up world and have an honest discussion that we need to make this all happen. The other thing, and just picking up Ian's point, about young people joining law firms. And it's a little contentious. We didn't practice this before. But there is an initiative from young people not joining law firms that do work that is against the climate. And I don't know if some of you are aware of this campaign. You know, there are big law firms who are very keen on pushing the climate change credentials. In fact, a big bulk of their revenue from taking on cases which are actually the other way. And I just flagged that up as an issue for some law firms. And it certainly makes me think about some of the law firms I work with as well, in terms of the work they do, even though they're claiming to be green. There you go. I think I'll stop now before I get turned off. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that we could definitely have a full seminar on that question, Damien. And there's a definite interaction between our ESG issues in terms of climate change, social transition, but also the importance of the rule of law and how we make sure that we still have that kind of clarity of law for everyone. But the questions are starting to come through thick and fast now. Quite a few of them focusing on the climate piece. A particular question here, I think directed at Ian, but I don't know also, Nick, whether you've done any of this at Vodafone. On the climate literacy point, do we think there's any plans to offer an industry-wide climate literacy training toolkit? Great to see how we could see that being rolled out wider. I mean, I know the DLA White Paper one, for example, because you know, I helped in some of the sessions developing it, was very much a kind of long road, making sure that it was quite targeted to the firm, but with a lot of kind of common elements as well.
Yeah, you know, from the outset, we want to open source the materials that we've developed for our own carbon literacy training. We've worked with the Carbon Literacy Group, so we've worked with external providers to hone the training. They provide the training actually across all sectors, including the public sector. So once we've nailed what we think are good sets of materials, we will open source them or make them available. Why not? And then folk can go away and tailor them to their own specific needs. And we, as members of Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, have said to those guys that we'll make it available to that group and more widely. For sure, watch this space.
Nick?
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I think would be super useful. And you know, we have tried to engage, you know, individually with some of our panel firms to kind of try and, I don't know if upskill is the right word, but you know, to do some sort of, I guess, educational type work with our legal team to get people just to be thinking about it more and familiar with the terminology. But yeah, if we something that was sort of a standard, you know, across the legal industry, I think would be incredibly helpful. Yeah, because I also think as clients, because like I say, like, you know, I'm not dedicated to ESG. I'm probably not educated enough to know what I need to ask for if I go to a law firm and say, well, can you do a session on this? So yeah.
Great, and I think there are obviously some really good public tools available, some of which are used in the climate literacy training. At Watson Farley, we use the Geeky app, which is an app which allows you to measure what your carbon footprint is and have competitions with your colleagues to see who can increase their score by the most. We've got a leaderboard and it's all very competitive. But I think part of this, you know, if I'm looking at the advisory work that I do, one of the most difficult things is really embedding and implementing ESG strategies into companies, and really getting employees and other stakeholders on board. And I think, you know, something like that app where it is a bit competitive, where there's a lot of different ways to kind of share experiences, is a good way of being able to get people really excited and really engaged in those things as well. Okay. Did the panel want to add anything else on climate literacy and net zero before we move on to a slightly different topic? No, silence is golden. Okay, so we are obviously an SCL panel today, and that's focusing on computers and technology and law. And we've had a specific query in around any good practice that anyone's seen around data. And that's going beyond cybersecurity. Obviously a really difficult issue. Raluca, you're nodding. Have you got anything you can share?
I have a dilemma to share. I have seen the question as well, and I thought it was really interesting. And I definitely recognize this because also if we look at the terminology that is used across, we use ESG, sustainability, responsible business conduct, and some people use them as the same thing, some people use them as very different things and being very religious about it. Also, it's very important to note how legislation is moving around, in terms of marketing claims. Very important for businesses and for investors that put into the market sustainable products or sustainable financial products. But beyond that, one dilemma that came to mind when I was reading this question is how we at Fairphone, in order for us to really understand what the impact of the devices are, we need to work with our users, and we need to also educate them towards helping us improve our products. And one of the pillars of Fairphone being fair is longevity. So we really think that by keeping a phone into the market as long as possible, that is one of the biggest contributions you can make to sustainability. The most sustainable phone is the phone that you already have, which goes a little bit against all of the marketing claims around, Biden latest and greatest technology that's coming up every year. So it was always a struggle for us to balance the privacy of our users, which is really, really important for us as a company, and getting the data that we need on an anonymous basis regarding the way our phones live in the market and for how long does a Fairphone live, because we sell a phone and then we will have to we need to know for how long it's being used in order to know how well we're performing in terms of longevity. So we have come up with a couple of solutions there around how do we inform the people around the importance of sustainability. What does it mean? Not only looking at privacy consents, but also creating a Fairphone app that actually tells the story of why this is important and how do you create more responsible user conduct, and really taking our users and customers along with us. Because what we see is that, especially for companies like Fairphone, is that our customers are the ones that keep us accountable the most. And sometimes we would wish to see that more from our investors, from our other stakeholders as well. But the truth is that the one that really push us to raise the bar and remain a thought leader are our users. So that dialogue is really important.
Yeah, I think data is a really difficult one when we think about sustainability and ESG, because in all that we do, we want to be able to see how effective we're being. We want to be able to be transparent and show people whether we've been successful or whether things perhaps haven't been successful. And we need to collect the data in order to track these things. But that brings the other side of what data is it really fair to collect? Are people really giving informed consent to us having this data? There's some really extreme examples, and I'll say that these comments were made quite a number of years ago rather than recently. So don't take it too much out of context. But, I was having a discussion with one person, not a client, someone who worked in technology, thinking about how we had we could gather extra data points to ensure, for example, that the workers that someone said were working in a particular mine were really the ones there. And someone said, oh, it's okay, we'll just give them all electronic tags and then we can know exactly where all the workers are at all times, which obviously has its own very significant human rights impacts. But, you know, that's the reason why we look at sustainability and ESG together. We look at all of E, S, and G together and how they interrelate to each other. And there's no easy way of dealing with it. And as everything in life, it's a real balance. So we've also got some questions here about upskilling of lawyers and asking if the panel has any good practice to share on approach towards imparting relevant sectoral ESG knowledge and skills.
I mean, Sarah, what I can say is, because this is from the perspective of a big law firm, so we all can organize ourselves in a certain way. But we've pushed the ownership of the ESG agenda into the sectors, as you know, and on that basis, we're making sure that in each of the sectors there are sector owners and champions of the ESG agenda. And we are encouraging the sectors for their sectors to identify the ESG challenges and the opportunities, where stakeholders are, what the policy radar is looking like, and to identify those issues and then to map them against our clients. So by going through that process, those lawyers in the sectors are becoming very attuned to the ESG challenges, and they own the issues for those sectors. They almost do this kind of a risk analysis around ESG for their sectors and by extension for their clients. Of course, that's applicable to a big law firm. Seems like a fairly common sense approach, but probably worth mentioning.
Yeah, Damien.
Yeah, I've been involved with the Greenland arbitration in Latin America. And what we found was that what's true in Europe or in the UK isn't necessarily true in Latin America or in many parts of the world. It changes. And with these pledges, the things that you should think of doing, well, some of them you just can't do. Like, for example, in Greenland arbitration, we talk about using different kinds of lights. These lights either don't exist or they're massively expensive. And things with your printer cartridges, various UK, should we say, Western issues, developed country issues, just aren't relevant. And so I think it's important to understand the message in terms of who's receiving it. And we've had to be aware of that. And also just to remember that actually the world doesn't speak English. And it is important when you're trying to get your message out, use the language of the people you want to receive it. Thankfully, I was born speaking English, but most of the world doesn't speak it. And it's important to learn foreign languages as well. Really.
I would just add briefly in terms of imparting knowledge to lawyers, given that I'm not the right person to impart loads of knowledge, I ask people who are. So leverage panel, our external advisors, and there's something in it for them as well, right? It's good from their perspective to build relationships. And if I introduce them to people in the business who are interested in this stuff, then people will go back to them and maybe pay them for some advice. And internally, our sustainability team, so building relationships with people and for us, they sit mainly in our kind of public policy team, and they are real. They do know what they're talking about. They were the people that kind of came up with our goals on ESG that worked with science-based targets and organizations like that. And so I just drag them in as often as possible into legal all hands meetings and things to talk to people. So just leveraging off their knowledge. And again, that actually has proved helpful, because then later on people know that I'm interested in this stuff, and actually then people will come when they need some legal advice, and I can try and find them the right people, or I can connect people in legal to sustainability. So it makes you more visible, I think, if you reach out to people, and then you start to form these networks across the organization, and even in a big organization. So I would just say, ask whoever you think can help. Is the best way to get more expertise into the legal function.
Thanks, Nick. And I was really pleased actually to see in that question that the question has been asked about knowledge, but also skills. So I think if we look at, a lot of the international covenants, the state treaties, the voluntary standards, there's a real focus on consultation. And I know it's easy to say that in respect of the kind of social area, but there are a lot of people who've spent a lot of time studying the environmental and the climate change areas as well. And I think, the key skill is really listening, taking things on board, and being able to adapt. Now we're coming right to the end. I know a couple of people have already had to drop off for other engagements. I wonder if I could just get a short closing thought from each of the panel. Damien, turning to you first.
Okay, not going to mention mediation. I think, there needs to be a more cohesive approach to the many initiatives that exist, and they've all got to start talking to each other. And we have a conference in Costa Rica coming up in October where we're going to try and do that. A bit of a plug. Thank you.
Ian?
I think I'll leave with the point that I made earlier around the fact that advised emissions, much like advertised and financed emissions, is coming very, very quickly towards the sector, and the sector needs to understand what that means and act accordingly.
Nick? You're on mute.
Yeah, I think I'm keen for more of this kind of dialogue, and to engage with Adam from Lawyers for Net Zero is on, I think, and as he knows, I'm keen to engage with them, because this is like in real life. I think a lot of people have good intentions and would like to make a difference, but as Raluca was saying, it can be difficult actually to get people to move away from the status quo, which is the easy option. And we found that when we were developing those template clauses for our business, that even internally you get a bit of pushback, because it's going to make people's life a bit more difficult. It's something new to introduce into their negotiations with third parties. So I'm really interested to engage with other people and hear about their wins and how they've managed to achieve things, because I think there's real benefit for all of us in sharing things that have worked, things that haven't worked, so we can kind of leverage off each other's experiences.
Great. Raluca?
I think this was a great panel, and I also learned a lot from the people on this panel. So thank you for that. And one thing that I take with me, and also remembering something that one of my members throughout my professional career told me, when it comes to sustainability and to applying that to your work, you can never remove your personal feelings around it, because we all have causes that we believe in. And in the end, we have to bring ourselves as we are, as human beings, with our beliefs, to work as well. And that is, that is a strength. Look at that as a strength. And also, I think I really like Nick's call on, if you have something that you can share with another person, how can you help another person to maybe, help them on their agenda, help them promote, create a group and leverage that power of a team that can bring change inside an organization, and really bring people together around an idea. There's a lot that we can all do, even after the panel is gone, and just to reflect a bit about what is the next thing that I can do in my own work to include more sustainability, or to think in a different manner. So yeah, that is those are my thoughts.
Great. Well, my thanks to the panel, and also to Ruth Keating, who has been one of the driving forces to getting this event together, along with Damien, who's helped us source a lot of the videos at the beginning as well. Over to you, Ruth, to sign us out.
That's great. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to our panel. That was absolutely brilliant. I think what everyone brought was real practical input as well. Sometimes these panels on ESG, they can be full of good intentions, but I think we've seen lots of action there as well, which is brilliant. Not least, Sarah, your competitive app, which I'll definitely be downloading after this as well. To our attendees, thank you all for listening, and please do keep an eye out for future events as well, and send your ideas in. And thanks everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.